Denzel Washington stood at the heart of the Supreme Court chamber, the afternoon light pouring through the towering windows, casting dramatic shadows across his serene face, a mask of quiet strength. Moments before, Chief Justice John Roberts had pointed directly at the Academy Award-winning actor, his voice ringing with authority as he declared, "Mr. Washington, your blatant contempt for this court's authority leaves me no option but to hold you in contempt. The marshal will take you into custody until you adhere to this court's order." A collective gasp rippled through the assembled crowd, Supreme Court reporters sitting motionless, disbelief etched into their features, unable to process the scene unfolding before them. Never in modern judicial history had a Chief Justice moved to jail a revered public figure during proceedings, the audacity staggering. The marshal of the court hesitated, visibly uneasy with the unprecedented directive, his reluctance palpable. What transpired in the next 5 minutes would jolt the entire nation, redefine the Supreme Court's bond with the public, and leave the typically stoic Chief Justice visibly moved in a way no legal scholar had ever witnessed. Washington was poised to take an action so powerful and unforeseen that it would alter the course of American judicial history forever. Before we unveil precisely what Denzel Washington did that day in the nation's highest court, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. You won't encounter this extraordinary story, covered with such depth, anywhere else in the media. To comprehend the magnitude of this confrontation, we must first explore who these two commanding figures are and what brought them to this remarkable standoff. Chief Justice John Roberts has presided over the Supreme Court since 2005, meticulously shaping an image as an institutionalist devoted to safeguarding the court's credibility and independence. With his Harvard education and impeccable legal credentials, Roberts has steered the court through increasingly divisive cases, striving to uphold its reputation above partisan politics. Renowned for his sharp intellect and strategic approach to legal questions, he takes pride in enforcing strict decorum within his courtroom. Court observers have noted his rising concern over the court's public perception, especially as polls reveal a declining trust in the judiciary, a worry that gnaws at his resolve. For Roberts, the court's legitimacy remains his utmost priority, a cornerstone he defends with unwavering determination. Denzel Washington, one of Hollywood's most esteemed actors, has claimed 2 Academy Awards and forged a 4-decade career portraying characters defined by moral conviction and unyielding principles. Less known to the public is Washington's profound personal commitment to justice and community service. Raised by a Pentecostal minister, his upbringing instilled deep ethical principles and a duty to stand for what is right. Off-screen, he has quietly funded numerous programs supporting education, housing assistance, and legal aid for disadvantaged communities. His generosity a silent force. Unlike many celebrities, Washington has shunned partisan political statements, focusing instead on core issues of fairness and opportunity, his voice a beacon of principle. The two men clashed in the Supreme Court during an extraordinary hearing centered on a contentious case involving housing discrimination. Washington had founded an organization providing legal assistance to families facing eviction in economically distressed communities, and when one such case reached the Supreme Court, his foundation submitted an amicus brief detailing the real-world impacts of the legal doctrine under review. The court, in an unusual move, invited Washington to speak during oral arguments drawn by his foundation's extensive data collection on housing discrimination across America, a rare privilege for a non-attorney that raised eyebrows in legal circles, though the court occasionally allows subject matter experts to offer specialized insights. For Roberts, this case posed a critical test of the court's approach to interpreting the Fair Housing Act, a matter of procedural integrity. For Washington, it marked the culmination of years of work with vulnerable families, grappling with housing insecurity, his heart invested in their struggle. The stakes stretched far beyond the immediate legal question. Hanging in the balance was whether powerful institutions would recognize the lived experiences of ordinary Americans facing systemic barriers. Roberts, committed to textual analysis and procedural consistency, viewed the case through the lens of judicial precedent, his approach rigid. Washington represented a voice demanding that human consequences be weighed alongside legal doctrine, his passion a counterpoint. As they faced off in the court chamber, two clashing visions of American justice hung in the air, with millions of Americans' housing security potentially shaped by the outcome. The tension had been mounting throughout the morning session, a slow burn igniting the air. Roberts appeared increasingly frustrated as Washington presented detailed accounts of families impacted by discriminatory housing practices, information absent from the lower court proceedings but meticulously documented by his foundation, each story a plea for attention. "Mr. Washington," Roberts interrupted, his tone measured yet firm. "While these anecdotes may be compelling, this court must focus on the legal questions presented. We are not a legislative body designed to address social problems." Washington nodded respectfully, his voice steady. "Your Honor, I understand the court's role. However, these are not merely anecdotes, but evidence of how the interpretation of this statute directly affects citizens' constitutional rights to equal protection." Roberts's expression tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "The constitutional questions were addressed in the briefs. Please confine your remarks to the specific information this court requested regarding your foundation's data collection methodology," he directed, his words a boundary. Several justices shifted uncomfortably, the room alive with unease. Justice Sotomayor leaned forward slightly, her interest in Washington's perspective unmistakable, her eyes keen. Justice Thomas, normally silent during oral arguments, watched the exchange with unusual attentiveness, his presence a quiet weight. Washington adjusted his approach, turning to the statistical evidence his foundation had gathered, and methodically outlined disparate impact data from 12 major metropolitan areas, revealing patterns the formal court record had overlooked. His voice a steady rhythm of facts. "This information should have been presented at trial," Roberts interrupted again, his frustration more evident, his patience thinning. "The court cannot consider new evidence at this stage." "Chief Justice Roberts," Washington replied evenly, his composure unshaken. "The evidence was presented to the trial court, but excluded on procedural grounds. The families affected by that decision lost their homes while awaiting procedural justice." His words a quiet challenge. Roberts's face reddened slightly, a rare crack in his facade. "Mr. Washington, you are not an attorney and seem to misunderstand fundamental aspects of our judicial process. Evidence excluded at trial remains excluded on appeal. That is foundational to our system," he stated, his tone unusually dismissive, a sharpness that cut through the chamber. Washington remained composed, standing tall at the lectern. "With respect, Chief Justice, my foundation employs 23 attorneys who have advised me on these proceedings. The procedural exclusion occurred because the families couldn't afford the expert witness fees to authenticate the surveys. They lost their homes not on the merits of their claims, but because of financial barriers to presenting their evidence." His voice firm yet measured, a plea wrapped in reason. Roberts's patience visibly waned, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Washington, this court did not invite you here to critique the judicial process. Your foundation's involvement does not grant you license to challenge established procedures that maintain the integrity of our legal system," he retorted, the atmosphere growing increasingly tense. Justice Kagan glanced at Justice Barrett, both clearly concerned about the exchange's direction, their expressions a mirror of unease. Attorney General Elizabeth Prelogar, seated in the front row, appeared visibly uncomfortable, her discomfort a silent witness to the confrontation unfolding. Washington reached into his briefcase and withdrew a document, his movements deliberate. Chief Justice Roberts, I have here affidavits from 73 families who were evicted while their procedural appeals were pending. Their stories deserve. Roberts struck his gavel sharply, cutting him off. Mr. Washington, those documents are not in the record before this court. I have asked you repeatedly to confine your remarks to the specific information this court requested, his voice rising with authority. Washington remained calm but resolute. Your Honor, with respect, justice that ignores the human consequences of legal procedures is not justice at all. His words hanging heavy in the silent chamber. Several veteran court reporters would later describe it as the most tense moment they had ever witnessed in the Supreme Court, the air thick with anticipation. Roberts's face shifted from frustration to genuine anger, his composure fraying. Mr. Washington, you have been invited here as a courtesy, not to lecture this court on justice. You will either comply with the court's directives or conclude your remarks, he warned, his tone a final stand. Washington stood silently for a moment, locking eyes with the Chief Justice, then, instead of retreating, placed the affidavit on the lectern and began reading the names of each family and their fates after eviction. The Williams family, including 4 children under age 10, now living in their car. The Rodriguez family, the father suffering from cancer, separated into different homeless shelters, his voice a steady lament. Roberts struck his gavel 3 times in rapid succession. Mr. Washington, you are in direct contravention of this court's instructions. This is your final warning. His authority cracking under the weight of the moment. Washington looked up from the document, his expression resolute yet not defiant. These stories are the substance of justice, Your Honor. Procedural rules that silence them serve only to— Mr. Washington, Roberts interrupted, his voice sharp with command. Your blatant contempt for this court's authority leaves me no choice but to hold you in contempt. The marshal will take you into custody until you comply with this court's order. The courtroom erupted in whispers, several justices appearing stunned by Roberts's extraordinary action, their faces a mix of shock and concern. The marshal rose hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable with the unprecedented directive to detain a national figure within the Supreme Court chamber, his steps faltering. As Washington stood calmly at the lectern, the tension in the chamber reached its breaking point, the air electric with expectation. What he did next would stun the nation and transform the relationship between America's judicial institutions and the citizens they serve. As the marshal approached with hesitation, Denzel Washington reached once more into his briefcase and produced a small, worn Bible. With deliberate calmness, he placed it beside the Constitution that always rests on the lectern during Supreme Court proceedings, a symbolic gesture that silenced the room. Chief Justice Roberts, Washington began, his voice resonant yet measured, before I am taken into custody, I would like to share something with the court. Roberts, perhaps sensing the unprecedented nature of the moment, nodded slightly, his expression softening. Washington gently opened the Bible to a marked page, his hands steady with reverence. This Bible belonged to my father, a Pentecostal minister who taught me that justice and compassion must work together. He passed away while I was filming Philadelphia, a movie about a legal system that initially failed a man seeking justice. The chamber remained utterly silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Next to his Bible, I've placed our Constitution, another text my father revered. He taught me that both speak to our highest aspirations for justice, Washington continued, his voice carrying a quiet power. He then did something extraordinary, pulling from his pocket a small, tattered photograph and holding it up for the court to see, his emotion palpable. This is Maria Hernandez and her 3 children. Before becoming an actor, I worked as a youth counselor in her neighborhood. When I was struggling to find acting work, her family invited me to dinner, despite having barely enough for themselves, he said, his voice trembling with memory. Washington's emotion deepened. Last month, Maria was evicted due to the very housing practices at issue in this case. The procedural rules this court is upholding meant her evidence of discrimination was never heard. His words a quiet accusation. He placed the photograph gently on the lectern between the Bible and Constitution, a poignant tableau. I am not here as Denzel Washington the actor. I am here as a citizen who believes our justice system must see the human beings affected by its decisions, he declared, his voice gaining strength. He turned to address all 9 justices directly. I have profound respect for this court as an institution, but institutions exist to serve people, not the reverse. If stating that truth requires me to go to jail, I am prepared to do so. My father would expect nothing less, his resolve unshakable. The courtroom remained frozen in silence, the air heavy with emotion. Several justices appeared visibly moved. Justice Sotomayor discreetly dabbing at her eyes, her empathy clear. Washington pressed on, his voice steady yet filled with dignity. The families in these affidavits, their children sleeping in cars, their elderly going without medicine after eviction, they are not asking for special treatment. They are asking only that their evidence be heard. He turned his gaze directly to Roberts. Chief Justice, I understand and respect your commitment to procedural integrity, but when procedures consistently silence the same voices, generation after generation, we must ask ourselves whether those procedures truly serve justice. Roberts's expression had shifted from anger to a complex introspection, a rare vulnerability in the typically composed Chief Justice, his eyes reflecting a struggle within. Washington continued, his voice a call to conscience. My foundation has worked with over 4,000 families facing housing discrimination. 87% never had their evidence fully heard due to procedural barriers. That pattern should concern us all, regardless of our judicial philosophy. He then made his most powerful move, lifting the small Bible again. My father marked this passage from the book of Micah. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly? Those values need not conflict with rigorous legal reasoning. In fact, I believe they enhance it. Washington looked around the chamber, making eye contact with each justice. I am prepared to accept the consequences of speaking this truth. If that means detention, so be it. But I could not face these families or my father's memory if I had the opportunity to speak in this chamber and failed to truly advocate for justice. As Washington concluded, the courtroom remained absolutely silent, the marshal standing frozen, uncertain how to proceed with Roberts's contempt order, the tension palpable. After what felt like an eternity, Roberts cleared his throat, his voice lacking the earlier edge of anger. Mr. Washington, he began, then paused, seeming to gather himself, a rare crack in his judicial armor. To the astonishment of everyone present, a visible sheen of tears glistened in the Chief Justice's eyes, a human moment that stunned the room. Roberts blinked rapidly, striving to regain his typical judicial demeanor. The court will take a 15-minute recess, he announced abruptly, his voice slightly unsteady. The contempt order is temporarily stayed. As the justices rose to exit, several looked at Washington with expressions ranging from respect to profound thoughtfulness, their faces a gallery of reflection. Justice Thomas, in an unprecedented break from protocol, approached Washington before leaving and briefly placed a hand on his shoulder, nodding once, a silent gesture of solidarity that warmed the chamber. Court observers would later describe this moment as the most authentic human exchange ever witnessed in the Supreme Court. A fleeting dissolution of the formal barriers between the court and the citizens it serves, revealing the profound moral questions underlying all legal proceedings. When the court reconvened 15 minutes later, the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted, a new energy coursing through the room. Chief Justice Roberts, his composure regained but his demeanor noticeably altered, addressed the chamber. "Before we proceed," he began, pausing to choose his words with evident care, "I wish to clarify the court's position. While the court must maintain procedural discipline, Mr. Washington's perspective on how these procedures affect real citizens is not without value to our considerations." Legal analysts would later hail this statement as an extraordinary concession from a Chief Justice known for his unflinching procedural orthodoxy. "The contempt order is vacated," Roberts continued, his voice steady but reflective, "and the court will permit the submission of Mr. Washington's Foundation's research as a supplemental appendix, with appropriate opportunity for opposing counsel to respond." This unexpected reversal sent immediate shockwaves through the legal community, the decision reverberating with possibility. Within hours, the event dominated news coverage and social media, with Number Justice and Mercy trending nationwide as legal scholars, celebrities, and ordinary citizens debated the delicate balance between procedural rigor and substantive justice. The video clip of Washington, placing the photograph between the Bible and Constitution, became one of the most shared moments in Supreme Court history, despite the court's prohibition on cameras. Court artists' renderings of the scene appeared on every major news network, one sketch fetching a record-breaking sum at auction the following month. Inside the Supreme Court building, the impact of Washington's actions continued to resonate, a quiet revolution unfolding. Court staffers reported that following the session, several justices lingered in the conference room for over 3 hours, an unusually long discussion for a single case, their voices a murmur of reflection. Justice Breyer was overheard telling a clerk that the exchange had sparked the most substantive discussion of procedural justice he'd witnessed in his tenure, his words tinged with awe. The following day, Roberts took the highly unusual step of issuing a statement addressing the incident, his tone measured but introspective. "The court's commitment to procedural regularity remains unwavering," he wrote. "However, we recognize that procedures serve the ultimate goal of justice. When barriers consistently prevent certain communities from presenting evidence, the court has a responsibility to examine whether those barriers advance or impede our constitutional obligations." Legal scholars immediately recognized this statement as potentially signaling a significant shift in Roberts's judicial philosophy. Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe wrote that, in a single paragraph, the Chief Justice has opened the door to a more substantive examination of access to justice than we've seen from the court in decades. His words, a call to attention. The impact rippled beyond the Supreme Court. Within weeks, the Judicial Conference of the United States announced the formation of a special committee on procedural barriers to substantive justice, tasked with exploring how court rules might be adjusted to ensure economically disadvantaged litigants could present relevant evidence, a step forward fueled by Washington's stand. Washington himself remained measured in his public statements. In his only formal interview about the incident with 60 Minutes, he emphasized, "This isn't about me or any individual. It's about ensuring our justice system sees the human beings whose lives are shaped by its decisions." His humility, a quiet strength. Nevertheless, Washington's actions transformed his public image. While always respected as an actor of integrity, he now emerged as a moral voice transcending entertainment, his influence deepening. Law schools reported a surge in applications from students citing the Washington moment as inspiration, particularly among applicants From underrepresented communities within the legal profession, their ambition ignited. The incident sparked intense debate about the relationship between procedural and substantive justice, a dialogue that felt urgent. The American Bar Association devoted its annual conference to exploring procedural barriers to constitutional rights, drawing record attendance from judges, attorneys, and law students, their engagement a testament to the moment's impact. Perhaps most significantly, the Washington-Roberts confrontation appeared to influence the court's subsequent decisions. When the housing discrimination case concluded with a 6-3 decision, Roberts's majority opinion contained language that surprised legal observers. While procedural regularity remains essential to judicial legitimacy, procedures that systematically exclude relevant evidence from disadvantaged communities may themselves raise equal protection concerns. This doctrinal evolution, dubbed the Washington Principle by legal scholars, marked a subtle but significant shift in the court's approach to procedural barriers. Its echoes felt in lower courts that began citing this language when considering procedural accommodations for litigants facing extraordinary challenges. For Roberts personally, court watchers noted subtle changes in his questioning during oral arguments in subsequent cases involving access to justice issues. While maintaining his commitment to procedural integrity, he began posing more questions about how procedural rules impacted different communities' ability to present their cases effectively. His curiosity, a quiet evolution. 6 months after the confrontation, at a judicial conference at Georgetown University, Roberts made a remark many interpreted as reflecting on his exchange with Washington. The greatest threat to judicial legitimacy is not procedural flexibility, but procedural rigidity that creates the perception or reality that certain voices simply cannot be heard in our courts. His words a thoughtful acknowledgement. Washington's foundation experienced its own transformation, receiving over $50 million in new donations following the Supreme Court appearance, a flood of support that enabled expanded legal assistance programs in underserved communities nationwide. More significantly, the foundation launched a training program for attorneys representing disadvantaged clients in appellate proceedings, with a focus on preserving evidence for higher court review. Its mission deepened. Law schools across the country incorporated the Washington-Roberts Exchange into their curriculum, professors using it to illuminate the tension between procedural regularity and substantive justice. A teaching moment etched in time. A professor at Yale Law School observed, "In 5 minutes, Washington crystallized a fundamental tension in our legal system that scholars have been writing about for decades. It's become an essential teaching moment," her words attribute. The confrontation's most profound impact, however, was cultural rather than legal. By humanizing the abstract procedural questions that often dominate legal discourse, Washington made accessible to millions of Americans the fundamental question of what constitutes true justice in a diverse society. His voice a bridge. 1 year after the confrontation, the Supreme Court announced a new initiative to enhance public understanding of its work, including community listening sessions where justices would hear directly from citizens affected by the court's decisions. A step many saw as a response to the powerful example Washington had set by bringing human stories into the court's chambers, though not directly attributed. Roberts, in his annual year-end report on the federal judiciary, wrote words that seemed to reflect his transformed understanding. The judiciary's commitment to equal justice under law requires not only that we apply the law even-handedly, but that we ensure all voices can be meaningfully heard within the procedures we establish. Justice that is inaccessible is justice denied, his reflection a quiet shift. For Denzel Washington, the most meaningful outcome came not from institutional changes, but from individual stories. Maria Hernandez, the woman whose photograph he had placed on the Supreme Court lectern, was able to present her full evidence of housing discrimination in a new hearing, her family moving into stable housing the following year. A victory that warmed his heart. Hundreds of similar families found their cases reopened under newly flexible procedural guidelines, their lives touched by his courage. The Washington-Roberts confrontation ultimately transcended both legal doctrine and celebrity, touching on fundamental questions about American democracy itself. Whose voices are heard in our institutions? What responsibilities do those institutions have to ensure substantive as well as procedural justice? How do we balance consistency with accessibility? These questions will continue to shape American jurisprudence for generations to come, their resonance enduring. But one truth became undeniably clear in that electric moment in the Supreme Court. When human dignity confronts institutional rigidity, even the most powerful judicial figures may find themselves reconsidering the true meaning of justice. As Washington later reflected, "My father always taught me that real change happens when we're brave enough to speak truth with respect, even to the most powerful institutions." That day in the Supreme Court wasn't about challenging authority. It was about reminding us all what that authority is meant to serve. If you found this analysis compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth coverage of the institutions and individuals shaping American justice. Hit the notification bell to be alerted when we release our upcoming special report. The Evolution of Justice: How Citizen Voices Are Reshaping America's Courts.